Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you very, very much for making it out this evening. Thank you for also letting me speak in English. Thank you to Gabriel and Barbara for the invitation here. It's really a pleasure to visit the city, to learn more about the museum, and to speak with all of you tonight. I'm going to speak to you about two of my projects of the last decade. The first is the book Worldmaking After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination, which was published in 2019 in English and was translated into German 3 years ago, so published in 2022. The second project I'll talk to you about is a bit more recent. It's the exhibition Project A Black Planet, The Art and Culture of Pan-Africa. It was co-curated by Antoine Bird, Elvira Diangani-Ose, Matthew Witkowski, and I. To give you a little bit of background, it included 350 objects from all over the world, the United States, South America, across the continent of Africa and Europe, and it was work from the 1920s to the present, so just as recent as last year. In different ways, both of these projects, my academic book, Worldmaking, and this co-curated exhibition, have been concerned with the innovative, complex, and contradictory ways in which African and African-descended peoples have creatively responded to the histories and legacies of slavery and colonialism. While the exhibition explicitly names Pan-Africanism in its title, this names the project of Pan-Africanism, which is an attempt to forge solidarity and unity across Africa and the African diaspora. Worldmaking, too, was concerned with this, had a preoccupation with Pan-Africanism. For both of these projects, Pan-Africanism is not only limited to a vision of Black or African solidarity. Instead, it carries a more universal significance, which was indicated in the titles of the work. So, the world of world-making and the planet of Black Planet in this exhibition. And it really is my effort to show the ways in which how thinking from Africa can help us reimagine the world. And I hope you'll get some sense of that from what I'll share today. So as a political theorist and intellectual historian, working on this exhibition has been a rich opportunity for me to explore dimensions of the political history of Pan-Africanism. It's also really been an opportunity to think about the world-making that I described in the book really anew. I'll say more about this probably in Q&A, but the term world-making is quite evocative. It already suggests an imagination, a construction in the title. And the exhibition was a way to think about how cultural practices, how artists have engaged that work of visioning and making through various registers. So what I'll do today is provide just an overview of the central arguments of the book of Worldmaking After Empire. I won't offer a comprehensive overview of the exhibition, but what I'll do is draw on some works that were part of the exhibition to show you how the exhibition reworks this idea of world-making, how it shows us the ways in which political solidarity can be thought through some cultural works. So just now for the overview of world-making. So as I said, Worldmaking was published in 2019, but it really emerged out of my PhD work, which I completed in 2015. So it's a project that's been with me for a very long time. And it really was responding to two different dynamics. One was kind of the world in which I inhabited. I arrived to the United States as an immigrant in 2001. I started school a week before September 11th happened, and the world really changed after 9/11, to put it very minimally. So that was a period in which, as you all know, the U.S. launched two ground wars in the Middle East, and it was a moment of resurgent American imperialism, where even the kind of rhetorical commitments to international law were being very radically undermined and discarded, something that continues in the present. This was a period where the limitations such as non-intervention, sovereign equality, which had been organized to set limits, right, and contain aggressive behavior after World War II, were being discarded and diminished. So that was one kind of context I was concerned about. The second was a more intellectual one, which was that within my fields of political theory, philosophy, political philosophy, there was a real celebration of the post-Cold War period as a moment perhaps in which we could really inaugurate what many called a post-Westphalian world order, a world where we would move beyond the nation state and embrace a moment of cosmopolitanism. It was a hopeful moment in terms of normative political theory, inspired in part by the European Union, but also the ways in which economic globalization might be setting a stage for various projects of global democracy. So it wasn't, in my view, so much that these two different contexts for my book they didn't have a direct relationship with each other, right? So my argument wasn't that cosmopolitan political theorists and philosophers were simply imperial apologists or justifying the project of US empire. But the fact that this body of scholarship hadn't been attentive to the histories and legacies of imperialism meant in some ways that their celebration of the kind of decline or demise of sovereignty didn't fully attend to what that decline was causing or enabling in the real world. So really at the core of this book is a question about what happens when we center the history of empire, when we tell the world's a story of international order, of world politics, by thinking about the history of European empire and the legacies of the struggles to overcome that world. What visions of the world appear from the decolonizing world, or what would soon be called the postcolonial world? Of course, that's a really big question. There's lots of different places from which one could tell that story. But in the book, I really tell that story from the experiences of Africa and the Caribbean, primarily from the parts of those regions that were colonized by the British Empire. And I focus on these two regions in part because they're connected, of course, to my own personal biography. But these are places that were linked together by a history of slavery and had a number of intellectual and political networks that connected figures across these two regions. So there's a rich kind of intellectual history to be excavated from this world. And this is also what the cultural theorist has called the Black Atlantic, right? Focusing on the ways in which the Atlantic world that emerged out of the transatlantic slave trade also created conditions for political and cultural innovation to emerge. So in order to understand what vision of the world was produced out of empire, we must first ask, what was empire? What did that project of imperial expansion entail? So a very standard account of the problem of empire focuses on two features of empire. One is the structure of what's called alien rule or foreign rule, that one country rules over another, called the colony. So in these cases, Britain rules Ghana or Jamaica, and that this relationship or structure of alien rule is connected to another feature, which is that the colony, so in this case Jamaica or Ghana, is excluded from participation in international society. So they're outside of the international society of states. So here I've just put a piece I really love by the British artist Yinka Shonibare, which references the moment of the Scramble for Africa, the 1885 Berlin Conference, where European states met to carve up the continent and divide it among themselves, right? And he's, beautifully registered the kind of thoughtlessness with which this process of administering the Africa was taken up by severing the heads of the figures who are seated at the table, right? So you could see this moment as a moment in which alien rule is being organized, right? What's happening in this process is that different states are claiming different parts of Africa. But another way of thinking about this moment of 1885 is that it actually is part of a longer history of what I call in the book unequal integration and racial hierarchy. So it's not that Africa was excluded from the world order and only kind of subject to alien rule. It was that prior to this moment of carving up the territories of Africa, there had been a long history of economic subjugation that went back to the history of the slave trade that created this unequal political and economic position such that Europe could carve up the continent of Africa. So one is this long history of unequal integration, economic integration. There is also dimensions of this process in which African territories and societies have some forms of rights under international law, but only recognized in their breach, basically, right? So if those familiar with the history of colonization in Africa will know that treaties were a central part of how colonization happened, right? So, people were asked to sign away their rights, and that structure of unequal treaties demonstrates the ways in which African societies had some rights in international society, but only those rights that they could basically dispossess themselves. So this is a kind of longer history, and I think in Shonibare's work here, that longer history is referenced by the use of Dutch wax prints, right? So that references that longer history of trade and circulation through which Africa and Europe had already been connected long before we get to this moment of the late 19th century. By by thinking about empire as this process of unequal integration, it allows us to think about states like Haiti, Liberia, and Ethiopia, all of which were independent in 1895 and remained independent at least until we get to the interwar period. So many would say these states were never colonies, right? But under this theory of empire as unequal integration, we can see the ways in which all of these three states were subject to that form of legal unequal integration. They had some rights. They were members of the League of Nations, for instance, but each of these states would undergo forms of occupation and debt, indebtedness during this period of the interwar period. So Haiti was under U.S. occupation from 1915 all the way to the 1930s. Liberia was heavily indebted, mostly to the United States, and was threatened with becoming a mandate of the League of Nations. And then finally, Ethiopia, which secured membership in the League of Nations in 1923, was subject to Italian occupation in 1935. So for each of these states, independence basically didn't prevent them from becoming subject to forms of imperial encroachment. For a number of Pan-Africanists in the 1920s and 30s, there would be overwhelming focus on the fate of these three states. Almost every figure of the movement we can think of, George Padmore, who I'll say more about in a second, CLR James, others, focused and wrote about what happened to these three African and Caribbean states. Why was independence not enough to prevent them from being subject to imperial expansion? So this period of the interwar, the 1930s and 40s, or sorry, the 20s and 30s, were a period of profound Pan-African and anti-colonial activity. This particular publication, International African Opinion, was published by what was called the International African Services Bureau. It was founded in London by CLR James and George Padmore, who at that time had left Hamburg after being expelled by the Nazis. And they started IASAB, International African Services Bureau, to support Ethiopia during the occupation, Italian occupation, and published this pamphlet as a way of articulating a kind of international vision and to critique imperialism. So their critique in this moment really focuses on racial hierarchy. And they're interested not only on the fate of the unequal position of black states like Haiti, Liberia, and Ethiopia, but are telling a story of what W.E.B. Du Bois in 1900 had called the problem of the color line. And their argument is that racial hierarchy structures the world order. It creates inequality, legal, political, and economic. And that this has, again, as I said, to do with a long history of Africa's place in the world that begins with the transatlantic slave trade. So this is one in which Africa is constitutive of the world economically, right? The extraction from the continent helped to make the modern world. So it's constitutive of the world, but nevertheless remained marginalized in that world. And this is the kind of conception of empire that's being worked out in publications like the International African Opinion, but a wide array of periodicals that are emerging in this period of the 20s and 30s. And I'm happy to say much, much more about interwar Pan-Africanism in Q&A. Okay. So as the kind of, we're like speeding through history here, but there's a number of very important Pan-African congresses and conferences that are organized throughout the early 20th century. Most of them until 1945 happened in Europe. So this is the 1945 Pan-African Congress, which was held in Manchester, United Kingdom. It's thought to be one of the most consequential congresses because a number of leaders that would go on to lead national independence movements met there. So Jomo Kenyatta was there, Kwame Nkrumah was there, W.E.B. Du Bois, sort of a forefather in the congresses, was also there, among others. So here, and there's a pamphlet that's published that collects all the kind of speeches and declarations of this conference called Colored and Colonial Unity. It's published by George Padmore as well. And what you find in this, at the Congress, is a view of imperialism that operates or that a critique of imperialism that operates around these concentric circles. So focusing on multiple levels, thinking about the consequences of imperialism for the individual subject of empire, the collective, and the international level. And as you can see, around the question of the individual, there's a focus on the structure of arbitrary power, on the exclusion from civil and political participation. At the level of the collective, a real emphasis on the absence of what would become self-determination, the right to govern oneself, right? To be able to collectively decide one's fate as a society. And then at the international level, a focus on inequality, so that structure of unequal integration that I was just speaking about. Again, thinking at the levels of the legal, the political, and economic. So this would be the kind of structure of empire that the characters in my book are trying to challenge and overcome. Okay. Okay, so, and here's then is the, this is the kind of, as I said, that set of concentric circles is what anti-colonial world making is trying to respond to. So what I meant by anti-colonial world making in the book is really the projects that nationalists began to articulate that were trying to challenge the structures of unequal integration on that international level. So world making for many of the actors in my book is a counterpart to nation building. The argument is that we in the 20s and 30s, we saw what happened to independent nations like Ethiopia, like Liberia, like Haiti. And the lesson we take from that is that independence on its own, being recognized on the international stage is going to be insufficient to actually guarantee our freedom and liberation from structures of empire. So we need to create kind of an infrastructure, an international infrastructure that helps to support our ambitions of being independent, right? So world making is a kind of world making is a part of a national independence project. And I think one can think about it as kind of the scaffolding, the international scaffolding that one would need in order to actually be an independent nation. So that international scaffolding for in this period really takes three forms that I detail in the book. One of them is to secure a right to self-determination on the international stage. This would occur with a very important resolution in the UN Resolution 1514 that was passed in 1960. And that resolution basically universalizes the right to self-determination, says all peoples have a right to self-determination, regardless of their kind of underdeveloped status or any other, there can be no disqualification of a people for self-determination. Importantly, it comes with the caveat that the boundaries and borders of the nations as they exist should remain, and we can talk about that in Q&A. And it basically guarantees sovereign equality and non-intervention as rights of all nations. So that's the legal dimension of this. The political dimension takes the form of trying to create federations of states. So in Africa, this takes the form of trying to organize a United States of Africa. This was a project very much led by Kwame Nkrumah. It's occurring almost simultaneously with the project of European integration. So really, these are projects that are actually on parallel paths, and it's worth thinking about, why one project is ultimately realized in at least in some form, and this other one ends up at least not taking the form that Nkrumah imagined, which was really a kind of federation modeled on the United States with powers of taxation, with a parliamentary structure at the federal level. Instead, what emerges out of that project is the Organization of African Unity, now known as the African Union, which is a much more limited form of integration, really focused on functional and technical coordination rather than political and economic governance. And then I think the most ambitious project of world making was the new international economic order, which was really a project not only of African and Caribbean states, but all third world states, who tried to use the UN system in the 1970s to basically argue for a transformation of trade relationships between third world states and global north states, right? So if there's a kind of division of labor in which third world states are primarily producing raw materials that are sent to industrial states, they were trying to get better prices for their industrial goods, create more egalitarian trade relations between states, and basically try to create what in the book I call a welfare world that would be sort of the international counterpart to the welfare states that Europeans were enjoying in the same period. So in various ways, I think what we see from these three dimensions of international world making is that I think at the core of anti-imperialism, really, and the critique of empire, is an ambition for equality. Equality at the international level, and also, at the level of the domestic. Just stay here for a second. The subtitle of World Making is The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination. And in the book, I try to chart why and how this project ultimately failed. It's a long and complicated story, and I'm happy to say more about it in Q&A. But I was telling a smaller group earlier today that I think it's really important to pay attention to two features of the failure. One failure really has to do, again, with the structural conditions that they were actually challenging. So some of these, say the last project, the new international economic order, would have required, concessions on the part of global North states. That was never, forthcoming. But there are also important contradictions within these projects, right? Many of these states end up becoming authoritarian states very soon after independence, right? They're quite skeptical or don't take seriously challenges or demands for local forms of self-governance within these states. And I think these features of the kind of internal contradictions of the movement, as well as the kind of external limitations that these projects faced, are important to explaining why the project of anti-colonial world making was not realized. And I'm happy to say more about that. So even as these projects have, are unrealized or failed political projects, I think one lesson of the book is in a way, if from our vantage point, it looks almost obvious and inevitable that European empire was going to end, that we would end up in a world after empire. But if you look at it from the perspective of those who were struggling for the end of empire in 1945, there's nothing obvious or straightforward about that, right? It didn't look in 1945 like that in 30 years and 40 years, the project of 500 years of European imperialism would have come to an end, right? So I hope that even as the book is charting a set of failed projects, that it leaves us with some optimism about the kinds of, that it opens our own political ambitions or horizons up in a moment in which there isn't a lot of optimism in our present either. But as I said, in the curatorial work I've done, one of the things I've found so striking and significant is the ways in which some of the kind of ideas that I was charting in the book show up in various forms of contemporary cultural production, and they help us kind of reanimate these questions in new ways. So what I'm going to do now is share some examples of work from the exhibition that demonstrates this connection between, the political history I've told you in a very brief form and some of the work that I've been working with now. So as a start, we might look at this recent work of the Chicago-born artist Dred Scott. For the 2024 Venice Biennale, Dred Scott created an all-African peoples consulate in Venice, and this consulate offered citizenship in an imaginary pan-African Afrofuturist union of countries to all those who were of African heritage. So the consulate was manned by Black Italians, many of whom were migrants or descendants of migrants living in Venice. And you could go to the consulate. I didn't have the chance myself, but you could go to the consulate, and if you were of African heritage, you would be issued with this passport. And if not of African heritage, you would be issued with a visa so you could visit the all African people's nation. So here we see the ways in which that dream of a Pan-African Federation, the United States of Africa that Nkrumah had planned, is being articulated and imagined, reimagined by a contemporary artist. This work also functions as a critique, right, of the various forms of restriction that African migrants currently face. So it reverses who gets to decide, right, entry and exit for African peoples. It's also a reminder that the passport as a technology of a national technology for the restriction of mobility is a relatively recent invention. It really is only in the 20th century that nation states began to issue passports and then began to curtail or limit movement and restriction. So this is a work really that invites us to reimagine the boundaries of the African continent, right? Refuse the kind of national distinctions within the continent of Africa, but also ask us to think about different possibilities and different ways of imagining our mobility around the world. So the question of contemporary migration and its restrictions across the Mediterranean also informed this wall relief work by the French-Moroccan artist Ito Barada. And this work really became for us a very important touchstone as we were conceiving the exhibition and thinking about what we wanted to achieve with the exhibition. So the title of this work, Tectonic Plate, is of course a reference to the theory of continental drift, right? That the continents at some point were much closer together and have gradually come further and further apart. So in this, what Barada calls a learning sculpture, she's put the continents on tracks so that you can't actually do it, but she can do it, move the continents closer to each other and further apart. But importantly, Africa itself is not on one of these tracks. So Africa remains at the center of the world. It is the immovable center around which all the other continents drift in and out. And in many of her works, Barada uses what kind of a Montessori type toys that just kids would play with. So this would remind you of a kind of puzzle or that kids would play with, and hence the idea of the learning sculpture. So for her, it's also, to call it a learning sculpture is to ask us to think about how we kind of learn our particular, the map of the world, right? And how we might, again, imagine it differently. In this work, too, she's shaded the continents in various tints of brown that reference, in some ways, skin color, right? Or could reference skin color. So there's no obvious way in which, I mean, Africa is the lightest continent, so it's also that the continent becomes the quote-unquote dark continent, right, is called into question by both making it the center point of the world, but also destabilizing the relationship of darkness with the continent as it's normally imagined. So while Dred Scott's All African People's Passport re-signifies that marker of nationality, the flag, another symbol of nation states, has been taken up widely in Pan-African history to contest the exclusions it entails. The Pan-African flag, which is the red, black, and green, it's probably the most iconic of Pan-African images. It shows up in all kinds of places, right? And it was a flag initially designed by the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the organization founded in 1914 by Marcus Garvey and his partner at the time, Amy Ashwood Garvey. So the flag originates again in 1920. It was a response to a racist song circulating in minstrel shows in the United States, which was called Every Nation Has a Flag, but the coon, kind of a derogatory term for black people. So this flag of the red, black, and green was created and kind of as a way of symbolizing a black nation that had no territory, a people that was far-flung, that was in every corner of the earth, but claimed Africa as a kind of original homeland or spiritual homeland. So it helped to visualize the African nation as a mass movement, ever on the move. It's really also important that it has no you can see the original in this photograph of the Black Cross nurses, an auxiliary of the UNIA. It has no stars, scepters, or any other symbols to clutter the visual field. So it's just those red, black, and green stripes. And it's in a number of contemporary artists have taken those colors and reworked it. So we have one example here from Chris O'Feely, a British artist living in Trinidad, in which he takes the Pan-African colors of red, black, and green and maps them onto the British flag, calling the work Union Black. So his iteration calls attention to the racial exclusions that have marked Britishness. So what is the place of kind of black Brits in an imagination of the United Kingdom? And also marrying the Pan-African flag and the Union Jack as he does helps to imagine different contours of not only Britishness but also blackness, right? So to think that Britain is the land or space in which the black nation could be realized, just as he's thinking about how Britishness might be reimagined to include its black citizens. So another kind of recent take on the flag is this work by the Kenyan artist Kawira Murichia. This is a series called To Revolutionary Type Love. And here she doesn't stick with the Pan-African colors. As you see, it's a range of colors she's using, but it carries forward this questioning of national boundaries. So in this work, Murichia uses Kanga cloth, a cloth that's ubiquitous in East Africa, and is also very central in marriage ceremonies, so in Kenya in particular. So during a marriage ceremony, a Kanga cloth is laid on the ground, and the couple walks across the cloth to mark their kind of entrance into their new lives together. As a queer artist, Murichia said that one of the reasons she wanted to create this work was because as a queer person living in Kenya, she would not have the ability to participate in such a ceremony to mark, her love. So what she's done in this work is basically redesign the flags of nations, and she does so by highlighting a queer activist from that nation. She planned to do a flag for every nation. We know she completed about 60 before she passed away very tragically, very young also. So each Kanga has a pattern border inspired by institutions for queer folks in the chosen country, a flat monochrome expanse, and centered on that background, either a repeating design of the drawings of one or two activists derived from photographs that she found through online research. In some instances, the portraits and patterning were replaced by symbolic images such as fluttering birds or upraised arms. So in places where she couldn't find a photograph of a queer activist, she used other symbols. Following standard Kanga design, each cloth included a phrase in Swahili, presented as if it was a phrase uttered by the depicted activist or the named countries, but in fact it's sourced from colleagues in Nairobi's queer community. So one of the messages says, "It is impossible, white and black are the colors of love." Another says, we love romance and we don't ask for forgiveness. So what's amazing about this iteration of the flag is that it scrambles national boundaries in a number of ways, right? One, national belonging in each of these flags is now signaled by queerness. Two, a vernacular textile from East Africa is being used as the material and format for the highest expressions of state, right? The symbol of the state and the state everywhere around the world is being taken from this vernacular textile of East Africa. This work was initially shown at the Goethe Institute in Nairobi, and I believe it was also shown here in Germany, but I'm not sure exactly where. So I think it's also an important, way of saying that the forms of, in a moment where there's so much rolling back of funding of the arts, how significant and important it is to have these forms of cultural diplomacy, because they help to support incredible work around the world. And I'll show this work, another German connection. This is by the artist collective, Ingrid Mwangi and Robert Hutter, who go by the combined name Mwangi-Hutter, a couple working together in Berlin and in Nairobi as well. So in this particular work, we're seeing a cropped photograph of Mwangi's stomach, in which she's basically, through different forms of exposure to sunlight, has mapped the German, an outline of Germany and an outline of the African continent onto her stomach. So in various ways, this is a work that speaks really to that heart, to the question of the global color line that I mentioned earlier. The body here is treated as the kind of canvas for worldly projections, and they've, in a very literal way, territorialized the skin. Territorialization, Catherine McKittrick reminds us, marks and names the scale of the body, turning ideas that justify bondage into corporeal evidence of racial difference. Such markings render the body decipherable and knowable. So usually, race is something we imagine as something that we see, that's tangible, that's visible, that clearly demarcates. The crop of these photos kind of reinforce this by giving us no other personal, we don't see the face, we don't see any other defining feature except this crop of skin. But the fact that the same body can be marked as both Africa and Germany destabilizes the idea that the skin can be the sign of racial difference, suggesting that for all its hypervisibility and supposed legibility, it can be the site for disrupting the meanings that have accrued to it. They take this disruption a step further by describing Africa as the bright, dark continent. So again, destabilizing that view of Africa as the dark continent, and representing Germany as the burnout country, the country whose light has faded, whose time has passed. These territorial markings are produced, as I said, by over and under exposure to sunlight. But there's also a way in which, they appear almost like birthmarks. And I think the thing about birthmarks is we think of them as something that one is born with and stays with you over time, over the course of your life, right? But birthmarks actually change shape and color over the course of our lifetimes. So again, this view that the skin is a stable referent for racial difference is being undermined by the sense that, if you read this from left to right, it's almost as if the burnout country of Germany becomes over time the bright, dark continent of Africa. So you'll have noticed in a number of works, and I'll end with this, that the continent of Africa itself, the map of Africa becomes an important visual reference for the kind of projections, imaginations of unity and solidarity with which Pan-Africanism is, concerned. I want to end with this piece by Kerry James Marshall, born in Alabama, based in Chicago. This is his work, Africa Restored, or Cheryl as Cleopatra. And it's difficult to make out from this particular photo, but the continent is literally restored by cementing together these large chunks of plywood painted in this incredibly dark black, and on this canvas, Marshall has then added photographs of his own family members. So Cheryl as Cleopatra, Cheryl Lynn Bruce is his wife, who is an actress who played Cleopatra. So her photograph appears alongside other family members. And then alongside his family members, he's also placed iconic figures like Toussaint Louverture, Kwame Nkrumah, and other figures that are central to the history of Pan-Africanism. So just like Mwangi Hutter collapses the body and territory, here the continent and the family album, world history and intimate history become one and the same thing. They're brought together on this canvas of the African continent. And it's a reminder in some ways about that kind of concentric circles I described earlier, that the individual, the collective, the world, rather than thinking of them as separate or differentiated sites of struggle, are brought together in works such as these, but also in the work of anti-colonial world making I've described. So I think I'll stop here, and I think we're going to be in conversation with Gabriel for a minute, and then I really look forward to all your questions and comments. Thank you very much.